The boy's scream tore through the cabin. Sharp, sudden. The kind that silences 100 strangers at once. Every passenger turned, eyes snapping toward row 4. The flight attendant stood frozen, her hand still clutching the silver fork that had just jabbed into the child's leg. A thin line of blood slid down his skin, bright against the white napkin on his tray. I didn't mean," she stammered, but the words were swallowed by the hum of the engines and the growing murmur of disbelief around her. The boy, maybe 10, bit his lip to stop from crying. His small hands trembled, not from pain alone, but from shock. From the sudden realization that someone who was supposed to take care of him had just hurt him. A woman across the aisle gasped. Another passenger pulled out her phone. The attendant's face went pale. "It was an accident," she insisted, glancing toward the cabin crew for help. But no one moved. And then a deep voice came from behind her, steady and cold as steel. "Did you just stab my son?" Every head turned toward the man standing in the aisle. Calm, towering, dressed in quiet authority. No one on that flight knew who he was, not yet. But they were about to. The flight had taken off from Atlanta just 40 minutes ago, a smooth, ordinary trip to New York. Passengers were settling in, tray tables down, coffee cups steaming, the faint buzz of conversation blending with the soft whir of the engines. It was one of those calm flights where everyone seemed half asleep, halfway between the clouds and their own thoughts. In seat 4A sat a boy named Micah Carter, 10 years old, bright-eyed and endlessly curious. He loved planes, the engines, the wings, the feeling of liftoff that made his stomach flip. This trip wasn't just another flight for him. It was special. He was traveling with his father, David Carter, who had promised to show him how airplanes really work. What Micah didn't know, what no one on board knew, was that his father wasn't just an engineer or a frequent traveler. He was the owner of Horizon Airlines, the very company whose logo gleamed on the tail of the aircraft they were sitting in. But David never flaunted that. He believed in seeing his company the way his passengers did. Anonymously, quietly, without privilege. So he booked coach seats, used a regular name, and traveled like any other parent taking his son on an adventure. A few rows up, in the galley, Amber Lee, the flight attendant, was juggling too many tasks at once. She was new, barely 6 months into the job, but already carried herself with the sharp, practiced confidence of someone who believed they knew how people should behave. She'd been short-tempered that morning, her supervisor had noticed. She hadn't slept well, the flight was nearly full, and she wasn't used to restless children in her section. Micah had been one of those kids, excited, full of questions. He asked how oxygen masks worked, whether clouds felt like pillows, and if pilots were scared during storms. Every time Amber passed, he smiled and said, "Thank you, ma'am," in the polite way his father had taught him. But after the third question, Amber's patience thinned. She rolled her eyes, muttering something under her breath that Micah didn't catch. David, sitting across the aisle, noticed her tone. His brows furrowed, but he let it go. He wasn't there as a CEO today, just as a dad. Half an hour later, lunch service began. Amber pushed the cart down the narrow aisle, balancing trays, silverware, and those flimsy plastic cups of apple juice. When she reached row 4, Micah had accidentally dropped his napkin. As he bent to pick it up, the cart bumped, and his orange juice nearly spilled. "Careful, please," Amber snapped. The boy froze, startled. "Sorry, ma'am," he whispered. Amber's irritation spiked, the kind that doesn't come from one moment, but from a buildup of stress, pride, and prejudice. "Just sit still," she muttered, placing his tray a bit too roughly. The fork slipped from her hand, clinking once, then twice, before her frustration turned the small mistake into something else. The air in the cabin was still calm. No one yet knew that this flight, this ordinary, forgettable flight, was about to become the story the whole world would talk about. Amber's hand trembled as she realized what she'd done. The silver fork still glinted between her fingers, the sound of the boy's cry echoing in her head like feedback through a speaker. The cabin was no longer quiet. It was alive with murmurs, whispers, and disbelief. Micah pressed a napkin against his leg. The fork hadn't gone deep, but it had broken skin. His eyes were wide, his lips quivering, though he said nothing. He wasn't crying. He wasn't yelling. He just looked confused. Amber froze for a heartbeat, then leaned forward, her voice tense, panicked. "Sweetheart, it slipped, okay? I didn't mean—" A woman 2 rows behind muttered, "You stabbed him." Someone else whispered, "Call the captain." Phones began to rise in trembling hands. Screens glowed. David Carter stood slowly. He didn't shout, didn't rush. The way he rose, calm, deliberate, made everyone's voice fade. His face carried no expression at all, and that emptiness was more terrifying than anger. "Did you just stab my son?" he asked again, his voice steady, cutting through the noise. Amber's throat went dry. "Sir, please, it was an accident. I was serving." He moved suddenly, and David crouched beside Micah, gently removing the napkin from his son's leg. A thin red mark stretched across the boy's skin, small but undeniable. He looked up at his son's face. "You okay, buddy?" Micah nodded, silent tears finally escaping. Amber tried to regain composure, turning toward the other passengers. "Please, everyone, it was an accident. Let's just calm down." But no one was calm. The air in the cabin had changed. It carried tension, disbelief, and something else. Judgment. A man across the aisle spoke up. "Lady, you don't accidentally stab a kid." Her eyes darted to the galley, looking for help, but the co-attendant avoided her gaze. The purser, the senior attendant, had been in business class and was now being called back by passengers shouting for a supervisor. David stood, his voice low but firm. "I'd like to speak with the captain." Amber stepped in front of him. "Sir, please, sit down. The seatbelt sign is on." He looked at her, and something in that gaze made her step back. "Get the captain." A hush fell again. Even the engines seemed to fade under his words. Amber hesitated for half a second, then turned and hurried toward the cockpit. Passengers stared after her, whispering among themselves. A woman in the next row leaned over and whispered to David, "I got that on video, sir. Everything." He nodded once. "Keep it." When the captain arrived, he looked puzzled, unaware of the scene he was walking into. Amber was right behind him, pale, shaking, words tumbling out of her mouth. "It was an accident. He moved. People are filming." The captain raised his hand, commanding silence. "What's going on?" David spoke calmly. "Your flight attendant stabbed my son with a fork." The captain's brows knit. "Sir, I'm sure it wasn't intentional." "It doesn't matter," David interrupted, his tone sharp now, a blade sheathed too long. "What matters is that it happened. On your flight, under your command." Passengers murmured agreement. The captain glanced at Micah's leg, saw the blood, saw the cameras recording, and his professionalism cracked into fear. "I'll have to file an incident report," he said quickly. David's jaw tightened. "You will, and I'll make sure you file it under the correct department. Corporate liability." Amber looked between them, desperate. "Please, I didn't mean to. I thought he—" David turned to her, finally letting the fury show in his voice. "You thought what? That a 10-year-old boy was a problem? That his questions were an inconvenience?" His voice rose, not as a shout, but as power, raw and deliberate. "You're supposed to represent safety, care, and professionalism. Instead, you drew blood from a child." She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. The purser, now standing nearby, cleared her throat nervously. "Sir, perhaps we could discuss this after we land." "No," David said. "You'll discuss it now." The captain blinked, uneasy. "Sir, Who exactly are you to make that decision? David's eyes narrowed. You'll find out soon enough. The captain hesitated, uncertain whether to push further. Then, reluctantly, he led Amber back to the galley, instructing her to stay there for the remainder of the flight. The passengers buzzed again, voices overlapping, fragments of shock, sympathy, and outrage. Micah rested his head against the window, eyes still red. David sat beside him, quiet, for several minutes, his hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder. He looked out at the clouds, endless white rolling beneath them, and his reflection stared back at him. The hum of the engines filled the silence. Somewhere behind them, Amber was crying softly. Not from guilt, perhaps, but from fear. Fear of what might come when they landed. An hour later, the captain's voice came through the intercom, slightly shaky. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be descending into New York shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts. No one said a word. The tension that had started with a single fork now blanketed the entire cabin. When the plane landed, the moment the seatbelt sign went off, David stood. He lifted Micah's bag from the overhead bin, helped him into the aisle, and turned to the captain. I'll meet you inside, he said flatly. The captain nodded, sweat visible at his temples. In the terminal, security officers waited, summoned for a minor onboard altercation. But when David handed them his ID, their posture changed instantly. Their eyes widened. Mr. Carter. Sir, one of them stammered. Yes, David said evenly. The owner of Horizon Airlines. The words hit the air like a shockwave. Amber froze where she stood. The captain's face went pale. Even passengers nearby gasped. David turned to her slowly, his expression unreadable. You stabbed the son of the man who signs your paycheck, he said quietly. But worse, you stabbed a child, and you tried to excuse it. Amber broke down completely, tears spilling as she covered her face. Please, sir, I didn't— David raised a hand. Save it. You'll have time to explain yourself to HR and the authorities. He knelt beside his son once more, brushing Micah's hair gently. You okay, champ? Micah nodded weakly. Can we go home now? Yeah, David whispered, his jaw tight. We're going home. As father and son walked out of the terminal, whispers followed them like wind. Cameras flashed. People recorded. And behind them, Amber Lee stood surrounded by her supervisors, her face a mask of disbelief. Within hours, the story spread. Flight attendant stabs boy on Horizon Airlines flight. Social media burned with outrage. News channels demanded statements. But for David, none of that mattered. What mattered was that his son learned, even in pain, what dignity looks like when faced with cruelty. That night, in the quiet of their home, Micah sat beside his father, both silent for a long while. Finally, the boy asked, Dad, are you going to fire her? David looked out the window at the city lights. No, he said softly. The company will. But I'll make sure we fix the reason people like her ever get hired without learning what respect means. He turned to Micah and smiled faintly. And I'll make sure every flight from now on, every single one, feels safe for every child on board. Micah leaned against him, tired but safe. The boy closed his eyes as the night outside shimmered with stars, the sky where it had all begun. The next morning, Horizon Airlines headquarters buzzed like a storm. Phones rang, reporters gathered outside the glass building, and messages poured into the company's public relations office faster than anyone could read them. The story had gone viral overnight. Every social platform screamed the same headline. Flight attendant stabs 10-year-old boy on Horizon flight. Inside, the executives were scrambling. Lawyers whispered in corners. PR managers drafted apologies that sounded empty before they were even printed. The entire airline was burning under the weight of a single moment, a single action that no one could erase. But in one office, on the top floor, there was silence. David Carter stood by the window, staring down at the city below. The morning sun painted the skyline gold, but his expression was dark, unreadable. On his desk lay two things: a silver fork, sealed in a clear evidence bag, and a printed report from the crew of Flight 279. His assistant entered quietly. "Sir, the board is waiting." He nodded once, his jaw tightening. "Tell them I'll be there in a minute." He picked up the report again. Every line was professional, clinical, minor on-board incident, no lasting injury. Attendant expressed remorse, words that tried to shrink the truth. He placed the file down slowly and whispered to himself, "Minor? You drew blood from a child." A photograph on his desk caught his eye. Micah, laughing at the beach, holding a toy airplane. The memory stung. He had built Horizon Airlines on the promise of safety and care, values his father had drilled into him when he was a boy. "When people fly with you," his father used to say, "they're not paying for a seat. They're trusting you with their lives." That trust had been broken. When David entered the boardroom, the room fell silent. The directors, men and women who had always seen him as calm and steady, saw something new in his eyes: cold fire. "Let's begin," he said simply. The chief operating officer cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter, first, I want to say how sorry we all are for what happened. The attendant, Amber Lee, has been suspended pending investigation, and..." David cut her off. "Suspended?" "Yes, sir," she said carefully. "HR is conducting an internal review." He leaned forward. "A 10-year-old boy was assaulted on one of our planes, and you're telling me she's suspended?" No one answered. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the glass walls. "We talk about safety, diversity, inclusion, all these words we love to print on posters. But where are they when it matters?" The silence was heavy. One director finally spoke. "David, with respect, we understand your anger, but you're emotionally involved. Maybe it's better if you—" "I am emotionally involved," he snapped. "Because that boy was my son." Gasps rippled around the room. The directors froze, eyes widening in disbelief. The COO's mouth fell open. "Your son?" David nodded slowly. "Yes, my son, and that's why I'm not speaking as a father today. I'm speaking as the owner of this airline, and as a man who's disgusted by what it's become." He stood, pacing slowly around the table. "You want to talk about image? Let's talk about reality. My son wasn't in first class. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was just a black child asking questions. And that was enough to make your employee lose patience and draw blood. That's not an image problem. That's a sickness in our culture. No one could meet his eyes." David continued, voice low but steady. "I've read her file. Amber Lee, no prior incidents, excellent customer ratings. But she had 3 internal complaints, all from passengers of color. Each one resolved quietly." He slammed a file onto the table. "You covered it up. You didn't want bad press. You ignored every red flag because she smiled for the surveys." The PR director stammered, "We thought they were misunderstandings." "Sir, misunderstandings don't leave scars," David said coldly. The room stayed still. The sound of the city outside felt miles away. Then David's tone softened, but it carried something heavier. "You know what hurts the most? It's that if Micah hadn't been my son, this story would have vanished before it hit the news. That child would have been labeled disruptive, and that woman would still be flying tomorrow. That's how our system works." He paused, looking around the table. "Not anymore." He turned to his assistant near the door. "Bring her in." The board shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, you can't," I said. "Bring her in." The door opened. Amber Lee stepped inside, escorted by security. Her eyes were red, her hands shaking. She had spent the night in tears, waiting for this moment, terrified of what was coming. David didn't move. He let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. "Ms. Lee," he said finally, his voice calm again, dangerously calm. "Do you understand why you're here?" She nodded weakly. "Yes, sir, I just want to say how sorry I am. It wasn't intentional. I lost my balance, He raised a hand. "Stop!" She froze. He looked directly into her eyes. "You didn't lose your balance. You lost your temper." Her lips trembled. "I didn't mean to hurt him," he nodded slowly. "But you did. And now the world has seen what that means." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Please, sir, I've already been humiliated. My family, my career, everything's gone. I just want to apologize." David's gaze didn't soften. "Apologies don't fix what's broken, but they can be the start." He gestured toward the window, where reporters' cameras flashed from the street below. "Out there, people think this is just a scandal. But it's not. It's a symptom. You're not the only one to blame. We all are. Every executive who ignored a complaint, every manager who let bias slide because the numbers looked good." He turned to the board again. "We don't get to hide behind apologies. We fix this, or we shut down." The COO's voice cracked. "You can't mean that." "Oh, I mean it," David said. "We ground every flight for 24 hours. We retrain every employee, from pilots to janitors. We rebuild from the inside out." Amber looked stunned. "You'd shut down the airline?" David turned back to her. "If it means we'll never let a child bleed on one of our flights again?" "Yes." For a long, trembling moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, the COO nodded. One by one, the directors followed. David exhaled, the weight of years pressing against his chest. He looked back at Amber. "You'll never work here again. But I don't want you destroyed. I want you changed. Because this isn't just your failure. It's ours." Security stepped forward. She nodded silently, tears streaming, and walked out without another word. David stood still, staring after her. Then he looked down at the fork again. The tiny, ordinary thing that had become a symbol of everything wrong with his company. He picked it up, turned it in his hand, and said quietly, "Sometimes it only takes one sharp edge to cut through a whole system." And with that, he placed it back in the bag and walked out. Outside, flashes exploded. Reporters shouted questions. David ignored them all and walked toward his car, the morning wind sharp against his face. He wasn't angry anymore, just resolute. By the end of the day, every Horizon flight was grounded. News anchors called it the biggest corporate stand in aviation history. But to David, it wasn't about headlines. It was about a promise that the sky would never again be a place where cruelty could hide behind a smile.